Today we are talking about Kuzenbo. And we're talking about Kuzenbo specifically from a competitive perspective. That is because when you talk about Kuzenbo from a casual perspective or a fun perspective, there's not much to say other than the god is fun in his design and he can be very effective in, say, 3v3 or in Clash or in even casual Conquest, where I mostly hang out. But on a competitive side, we've rarely seen anything of Kuzenbo. He was played in a total of 10 competitive games in the SPL since his release. 5 of those were in 2017, and that year he won 2 of them and lost 3, but that was mostly around a time when Thorns was also still better, or as it's called now, Shield of Thorns. Whereas in 2018 he also had 5 games and he won a total of 1 of these games. So he overall has 10 games and a 30% win rate in competitive. And while he was not always picked by the team that was expected to be winning, you also have to keep in mind that Kuzenbo is a pick that you don't just do. If you choose to pick Kuzenbo, you pick him specifically to counter the enemy because he's such a niche pick. And he still only came out with the 30% win rate in situations that should have been favorable for him. This performance also shows across different roles. In jungle, he's never had a win in competitive. In solo, he still has significantly more losses than wins. And the only role where it's even is in support. That's a 50-50 rate, but that's because he's only been played twice in support. And the indications that things aren't really working out for him the way they should be don't end there. In ranked, his stats are actually somewhat similar. While in bronze and in silver, his win rate is above 50%, the moment you go beyond that, his win rate drops down drastically. His overall win rate is at 48.11%, but again, this is mostly due to bronze and silver, because with higher divisions, his pick rate also goes down very heavily. In gold, he still gets around 45% win rate. In platinum, even a bit higher, though still not 50%. He's very much around the 48% average. In Diamond Plus, it crashes down to a 36% win rate. So if that isn't terrible, I don't know what is. He's currently the 4th worst god in ranked conquest in Diamond Plus divisions. So I know, as usual, there will be some of you who want to tell me, well, I play Kuzenbo and I absolutely wreck face with him. And looking at your janky leveling order, you probably don't know what you're doing with Kuzenbo. And you would probably be right to at least some degree. But that doesn't deter from the point that he is statistically not performing well across many higher levels of play in different situations. And that is the big deal here. And I think with Kuzenbo, different from other gods, the problems here lie mostly in his kit. With some gods, you just tweak some numbers and it makes them better, but Kuzenbo's numbers have been tweaked quite a few times, and often I thought, hey, this might be the point where Kuzenbo can actually perform much better and where he can find his way into the meta. But it never really happened. There was a post from a Reddit user named Kuzenbo recently talking about some of these issues. I'm going to mention that quickly here because I'm going to implement at least some of his points or some propositions or talk about them as well, while I don't fully agree with the post and the poster seems to sometimes have a bit curious ideas overall. Let's first talk a little bit about his abilities and why they may not be working the way they might be intended to in some situations, and then talk about what can be done about that. First of all, his passive. His passive gives him damage mitigation for every time that he takes over 2% of his maximum health worth in damage. And this stacks up to 10 times. So this is a very cool passive, I think. This is a very useful passive for somebody who's primarily intended to frontline. This is an excellent passive for a Guardian that is either played in solo or in support, and I don't think I would have any complaints about this. There is obviously the effect that if you get knocked up, pulled, grabbed, or banished, or somehow disrupted, that you lose half your stacks, which I think is maybe a bit over the top in some situations, but overall, it's definitely not a bad passive and definitely not what is an issue for Kuzenbo. His first ability is Nene Kappa. This one is multiple things at once. It's a projectile that can ricochet twice, first off, but it doesn't actually get any extra ricochet damage, but rather just gets a Nene at the end that spawns and attacks the enemy. The Nene does a decent amount of damage if you hit a target, then the Nene himself can do damage to the targets afterwards, which doesn't scale though, it's just the base value. But the Nene Kappa's health scales with your own health. 20% of your maximum health are added to its health pool, and also leveling up will give it more base health too. On top of that, hitting someone with the Nene Kappa also slows them by 20%. This lasts for 3 seconds, not the crazy slow, doesn't scale up, but still a decent setup. I think the Nene Kappa is actually Kuzenbo's most balanced ability. It allows for a mix of aggression and setup, and it's definitely not the best CC out there, being a single target slow that you have to aim very well first too, but it's definitely not bad either. Because with the Nene Kappa you can do quite a few interesting things. You can bounce at long range and hit someone you would otherwise probably have not hit anymore. You can kind of body block the enemy with the Nene Kappa. You can have it tank towers. So there are various things it can be utilized for, and I think it does enough in itself. The second ability is Shell Spikes. Shell Spikes is an ability that I think is just a bit awkward. It's a damage reflect that scales from 10% to 30% depending on how much you level up, and at the same time it reduces the cooldown of Kuzenbo's other abilities. The cooldown also goes down by leveling, so that's an extra benefit. Now, the thing that I think is a bit awkward about this ability is the starting reflect is very, very low. You really have to invest into this ability, and if that is something that you want to consider in that match, it can be good, but sometimes this will be kind of neglected next to the other abilities. And at the same time, the cooldown reduction per hit is a bit annoying. That is because often you won't just spam away your whole kit at the start of a fight. For example, if you want to use your 3, you have to get close to the enemies first. If you want to use your 1, you might not need it right away if you want to set up in a specific way. And often enough, you will kind of lose at least half of the benefit from the shell spikes because you want to activate the shell spikes when you start taking damage. So all in all, it's a nice cooldown reset, and especially in laning phases this helps, but at the same time it feels very counterintuitive. You want to have the shell spikes up when you go into a fight, at the same time you want to use your other abilities a little bit later sometimes. But with the shell spikes, it's mostly that I think they got nerfed a bit too much, as a lot of pros especially didn't like them, and I think they could use a little bit of a buff, but they aren't inherently terrible. The 3 being a push that deals extra damage when pushing the enemy through other targets or against walls is probably one of the more interesting mechanics with how it works in regards to the damage amplifications, but at the same time, at higher levels of play, this becomes very, very predictable. You will know that the enemy Kuzenbo will try to push you through the wave, and especially if you max the Sumo Dash first, which was a reasonable decision for a while at least, then the surprise factor only works once, and high level players will know that, will not position so that you can push them through their wave, and then a lot of your damage potential goes to waste. Due to the turning radius and the width of the ability, it's also rather easy to avoid when you know roughly where Kuzenbo will be coming from, so this ability really shines in combination with Blink or creeping up on unsuspecting victims that don't have wards. So again, something that works very well on lower levels of play. The biggest issue, however, I see in the ultimate. The ultimate makes Kuzenbo spin and be CC immune and knock enemies back that are too close to him, and it's multiple small knockbacks in a row instead of one big knockback, so you can kind of lock an enemy in that. He also gets a 45% movement speed increase at the same time, and the first hit will deal more damage than the subsequent hits after that. The total number of hits here is 4. Now, I think Watery Grave is Kuzenbo's biggest issue. And why is that? His CC outside of his ultimate is very single target focused, very limited, and relatively easy to avoid or interrupt compared to any other Guardian really. Therefore, there has to be a strong ultimate to make up for that and really give him that CC that he's otherwise lacking to compete with Guardians in a support role or in a solo role even. Otherwise, he needs something else to compensate for it, like absolutely stupid damage numbers or something, but he doesn't have that. It's still a CC ultimate. But the intention of this ultimate is to push enemies away. It's to get rid of enemies that go into your team, and that's the job it gets done quite well. But if you want to win a game, you can't just always fight back and hope the enemy engages first. You will have to engage too. And that is where I think this ultimate falls short. Yes, if you blink into the enemy backline and you push them all forward and they don't use their beats, then sure, that can work. But the sacrifice that Kuzenbo has to make for that kind of setup, in order for it to possibly work, is already much bigger than other supports. Gap needs to blink into the middle of a team and sets them up in a way that they're right in the position where he wants them afterwards. And Athena just needs to dash and taunt forwards. Kuzenbo needs to either position himself behind the team and let his team have one less frontliner at the front, or he needs to blink in a very awkward way and hope that the enemies are positioned poorly in the first place. Otherwise, what will happen in most scenarios is he will push in one of the frontliners in a team fight, and that way he might effectively just help killing his teammates because he gives his enemies a little bit of a boost into the team. Even in other scenarios, Kuzenbo is often obviously used to set up for his teammates still. But if you knock targets away and you have more movement speed than your allies, and you're going to use that to try and stick to the targets that you knocked up, that will often result in one thing. You push the enemy away, deal a little bit of damage, and the enemy gets further away from your allies than before, and they won't be able to follow up and hit their abilities anymore. So what can be done about that? Some propositions again from the Reddit thread. The first one, he can spawn multiple Nene Kappas. I think this is absolutely fair considering that you have this cooldown reducing ability and you could theoretically be able to spawn 2 of them in some situations when you take a lot of damage, and I don't see why that shouldn't be a thing. It's part of his kit and it's kind of what the whole character revolves around in terms of his visual design at least, so let him have multiple Kappas. Why should one Kappa die when the other one spawns? The second one is the dash might need something. And I specifically like the idea here that his dash will now deal damage when you connect to a target and not when you start pushing a target into something. So the first instance of damage is when you connect with them, and then 2 more instances if you push them through something else. There was also the proposition to let him push multiple guards. I'm not entirely opposed to that, but I also don't think it would be that necessary or that helpful because often enough it won't even happen, and his big push ability is definitely the ultimate. But the most crucial thing for me, again, is the ultimate. I had an idea for the ultimate that I want to share, just, to get the idea out there at least. Currently, Kuzenbo's ultimate is purely a knockback for enemies. And obviously, changes to abilities are often hard to make because there's a visual animation tied to the ability. In this case, that's actually not a problem. Kuzenbo's ultimate makes him and the water around him spin counterclockwise. That means it would be very easy to change the movement of a knocked up character around Kuzenbo. What I propose is make it so that when an enemy is knocked up, they're not knocked back, but rather knocked around in this ultimate. I will visualize this here to make it a bit easier to understand. Instead of a target just bouncing back out of the ult, they will fly kind of counterclockwise a little bit further into the ult, land on the ground again, get knocked up again and fly a little bit further. And by the end of the ult, after 4 hits, they would have ended up from the direct front of Kuzenbo to the direct back of Kuzenbo. Or if they start behind him, the other way around. So they would definitely go around 180 degrees. This would allow for more setup for teammates, effectively pushing enemies out of your team or enemies towards your allies, depending on where you position yourself. It would still be a skillful ultimate, but it would require some strategic play depending on how you want to go along with it. But most primarily, it would give him a lot more value for team fights. I think this would make Kuzenbo a lot more impactful without having to drastically change anything else about him. And I think it would be a very interesting change to see that should be not too hard to implement, hopefully, due to the fact that the visual design is already there. With that, thank you guys for watching. Let me know what you think of these changes in the comments down below, if this is something you can agree with or if you have any other ideas for Kuzenbo. If you're new to the channel, click the sub button with bell, it really helps me out. Other than that, see you for the next one tomorrow. DukeSloth, out.